Smoke crawled along the plaza like a living thing, curling around boots and broken flagstones as cannon fire shook the air, and the bay moaned beneath the weight of quake-born waves. The execution scaffold rose above it all, iron bones and timber spine, two upright stones flanking the platform, where a man with fire in his blood waited in chains. Ace lifted his head when the rumble rolled through Marineford's ribs. He didn't have to see the incoming to know Whitebeard had spoken to the sea again. A crack like a continent splitting bled through the sky. Seagulls wheeled madly, and every Din lens across the world drank the moment like a prophecy it would replay forever. The plaza smelled of salt, gunpowder, and nerves. Marines shouted formation codes. Pirates howled names. Somewhere, a young man with a straw hat ran until the edges of his vision turned white. The red coat cut through everything like a banner. It belonged to a Marine with a sword at his hip and old scars who walked like he weighed less than his history and more than his rank. He did not need introduction. The crowd knew him the way a sea knows the wind that tames it and brings storms in equal measure. The cameras caught his white ink justice coat, the bare arms, the hair that had become a flag in 100 rumors, and the iron quiet of his eyes. When his boots touched the plaza stone, every loud voice near him dropped to a cautious murmur, as if remembering that sound could carry you into a man's domain without a rope. Admiral Red, some said with awe. Admiral Shanks, others said with the private shock of seeing a myth choose a different path and wear a sanctioned face. He stopped with the scaffold in his left peripheral and the bay under his right, measuring lines and people. The calculus of a war designed to be watched. The divergence had been decided years ago in a harbor with a boy and a hat and an unspent future, but it revealed itself here with the clean simplicity of an action you cannot undo. Sengoku had placed him in command of the plaza's left corridor, between Oris Square and the scaffold, where the ice itself made highways and traps. Contain without massacre had been the order, in the clipped cadence of a strategist who knew the difference between victory and the story of victory. Show the world a steady hand. Around them, the other admirals moved like opposing laws of nature, Aokiji's breath turning the bay into a pale mirror, Kizaru a geometry problem solved at light speed, Akainu a kiln that made corpses in policy. Shanks watched them and weighed their heat against the simple question waiting on the scaffold. Justice could cut in any direction if you held it wrong. The gates blew and ships pushed through the ice pack Whitebeard had created with a contemptuous sweep of ocean architecture. Allied captains, drunk on loyalty and the knowledge that their names would be said, poured into kill lanes, only to find them reshaped by genius, habit, and blind courage. Marcos skated the ice as a streak of sapphire fire, shouting warnings to men who didn't need them, and giving hope to men who did. Jozu threw chunks of a frozen tsunami with casual malice. Vista's blades sang counterpoint to cannon thuds. The Pacifista line, eyes cold as coins, marched forward and made a mechanical future grind against a human present. The world watched, hearts leaning, and the five elders sat behind lacquered Sabaody in a room far from spray and blood, listening to numbers and words like optics and deterrence, their gaze drifting again and again to one feed. Shanks, too close to the camera, too steady for their comfort. The first meeting between him and Whitebeard's reality happened in a corridor of ice that glowed blue underfoot. He stepped onto it the way a man steps onto an old debt. A wave of pirates saw him and hesitated, not because he was Marine, but because his presence changed the thickness of the air. The front ranks stumbled, as if tripped by something unseen. Those with stronger spines blinked through it, grips hardening. Conqueror's haki unfurled minimally. A warning bell, not a hammer, just enough to blur the edge of their confidence. He never liked pushing his will over men who'd already chosen what to die for. He did it anyway, because his uniform demanded a wall without spikes. When the first spear thrust came, a wild jab from a captain, whose name would be a footnote, Shanks turned his wrist and caught the blade on the flat of his saber, foot sliding to take the force, elbow compressing to redirect. He did not counterstrike. He stepped inside the man's guard, put 2 fingers to his chest, and let will roll through bone. The pirate's eyes went white. His knees kissed ice. The line behind him took 2 steps back in perfect herd logic. "Left corridor holding," Shanks said into his snail, voice level, pacing forward. "Redirect heavy hitters to center. Reinforce the Pacifista lane with shield teams. Do not let the crowd control our timing." "Understood," said Sengoku, a calm on the edge of breaking. "Maintain proximity to the scaffold. Report any anomalies on the broadcast feed." The anomaly arrived like a blade of light aimed horizontally at a boy. A green slash carved a trench through the ice, sending shards blooming. The camera found the black coat and the cross-shaped blade, and a face that did not change because it had no reason to. Dracul Mihawk lifted his sword again, testing distance not only to Straw Hat, but to the era's axis. The slash would have reached its target if Shanks' blade hadn't appeared in the line and turned the energy sideways in a spray of photons and frost. The impact vibrated up both their arms and into a memory neither of them had time to indulge. "Mihawk," Shanks said, breathing even. "Shanks," Mihawk replied, tone of a man remarking on weather. "We keep finding each other around young men who do not respect odds." The world saw 2 legends interact with the ease of old rivals, and drew conclusions it had no right to. The 5 elders leaned in. Garp's jaw tightened. Somewhere in the mess, a straw hat tilted as its owner staggered, eyes wide on red hair and marine coat. Recognition punching through shock and fear and fury so cleanly he nearly stopped running. Shanks looked past Mihawk, past reporters, past the part of him that wanted to grab the boy and bodily throw him at a horizon with shelter on it. He lowered his blade by a fraction. "Hold, Hawkeye," he said quietly. "If your curiosity is an arrow, choose a different target. There are pieces on this board you don't want to knock over today." "Warlords were invited to test the strength of this era," Mihawk murmured, shifting weight. "Don't call it curiosity." Shanks's laugh was soft as sand. "You never liked the taste of orders. Don't pretend." Another slash would have followed if a massive shadow hadn't cleaved the light. Diamond Jozu landed between them with the indifference of a boulder falling through history, his shoulder catching a beam that would have lanced the plaza. The impact shattered ice. Marines tumbled, regained formation, cursed. Shanks pivoted, catching Jozu's follow-up punch on steel, boots grating. Pain flared up his forearm where Haki met Diamond. He bled 3 centimeters inside the skin and ignored it. "Not today," he told the brute, eyes flicking to measure the tremor in the bay as Whitebeard's trident found a new fulcrum. And everywhere, beneath everything, Luffy ran. He sprinted like bodies were suggestions, and fear a thing that melted in his mouth. He ate punches with his face and got up before the second fist landed. He hurled himself at gaps that weren't gaps yet and forced them open with stubbornness alone. When a cannonball kissed the air above his shoulder, he twisted and it slid off him like a coin on glass, heat shimmering on rubberized skin. He laughed with his teeth at nothing and everything, throat raw, because laughter kept panic from making his legs heavy. Every time he fell, hands he knew, and hands he didn't shoved him back upright. The world saw him in the frame, clothes torn, hat tied, eyes too big, and some remembered children they'd told not to dream. The din-din filters caught a rhythm near him once, a double beat like a drum that wasn't a drum. It could have been a trick of adrenaline. It could have been the wind. He shoved the sound out of his head because he didn't have time to carry any more myth than the one in chains. Garp sat on the scaffold like a statue with muscle memory, knuckles resting on his knees, jaw clenched around phrases he would not say on broadcast. Sengoku stood at his side like a carved lion, voice feeding the system, mind running 3 wars, the one in the plaza, the one in the world's perception, and the one inside his fleet. His phone snail blinked, and the 5 elders cut in with the chill of an airless room. "Keep Admiral Red on task," one said, tone dry as iron filings. "Our patience for instability is measured in seconds." "His task is the war," Sengoku said without looking at the camera. "Do not micromanage me in the middle of history." "We see him protecting pirates," another elder commented, ignoring the correction. "We see him shielding a straw-hatted infiltrator with a history of insulting government property." "Does your admiral understand the difference between deterrence and sentiment?" Sengoku killed the line with an efficiency born of survival, eyes narrowing as a light moved on the battlefield in a way light should not. Kizaru atomized into photons and reappeared at the far end of the plaza, ankle bouncing idly as if he'd wandered into a garden party. "Ooh," he said in a drawl that carried over the din. "This is quite troublesome." He raised a finger and turned it into a weapon that punctured the future casually. Shanks stepped into its path to make sure the future had to dodge. The first time he truly let his hockey loose that day, it happened without theatrics. He simply grew heavier in a way the ground respected and the air noted, and the nearest 50 pirates crumpled like men who'd remembered sleep. A crackle ran over his blade as if the steel had decided to give itself a voice. Kizaru's beam knuckled sideways off it in a ricocheting gasp of light. The leftover photons went hunting for harmless targets and found an unoccupied parapet. Kizaru tilted his head. "Now that's rare," he said. "You call that rare? You should get out more," Shanks said back, and his sword blurred. On the far side of the bay, Whitebeard stood with his hand in the air, like a man reaching into the bones of the world to pry it into a shape that would hold his son. Cracks spidered through empty space. The tsunami that had been still under Aokiji's ice began to moan, then growl, then scream. The siege walls groaned and rose, iron mountains sealing the bay with the ugly grace of inevitability. Cheers went up for Marines who thought a fortress was a guarantee. Shanks did not cheer. He anchored his stance and tried not to think about all the ways trapped men stopped thinking like men at all. Luffy hit the plaza like a wedge, and the world bent around him. Smoker's jitte hissed, Hina's iron danced, Tashigi's blade flashed, Buggy's ego swelled, and the cameras loved it all. Every time he should have been stopped, chaos tripped over itself to let him through. When he flung himself into Ore Square, his chest heaving and fingers scraped raw, he saw the scaffold, really saw it, and something in him that had been screaming got very quiet. The quiet scared him more than the screaming had. He ran harder. Akainu saw him the way a hawk sees a mouse, who thinks it is a lion. His lips curled into a memory of a smile, and his fist turned the air to slag. Insolent, he said softly, and the heat of it ate the last word. He hurled a magma hound at a boy. The dog hit a wall that wasn't there a moment before. It shattered into cooling rock and bad breath. The wall was Shanks, blade down, shoulder turned to take the push, boots digging 2 grooves into the plaza. He looked at the molten spatter on his sleeve, at the steam riding off it, at Akainu's eye. Not him, Shanks said. What are you doing? Akainu asked, voice flat with contempt. Admiral? Stopping you from burning a child into a lesson, Shanks answered. He pointed with his chin at the scaffold. Your lesson is there. Akainu snorted lava. You grew soft playing at honor. This is not a duel under a sunset. This is history. It is written in blood, so it cannot be erased. Then write clearly, Shanks said, and his blade was already moving. Their first true collision shook the camera lenses and cracked a section of ice into guillotine slabs. Slow-mo impact showed the moment hockey met magma, the black sheen on steel, the red glow on knuckles, sparks kicking off like insects, heat waves wrinkling the air as if the scene were being burned into film while it was filmed. Marines stumbled back, faces pinned between awe and terror. Pirates roared because roaring was a way to breathe. Okichi's gaze slid sidelong from the bay to the duel, calculating how much cold it would take to keep the harbor from boiling if those two did not choose a different stage. Kizaru watched with amusement and the faintest edge of interest, as if watching 2 cats whose claws had learned new opinions about physics. Shanks gave ground, not to retreat, but to draw the line away from the boy who could not stop moving. Akainu pressed because pressing is the only verb he respects. The plaza beneath them went from stone to glass to broken teeth. Up on the scaffold, Sengoku measured the optics and the risks, and for a moment, just a breath, considered stopping the execution and ending the war with Whitebeard alive, the Marines unbloodied by an indelible cruelty, and the government screaming. The 5 elders called again, softer this time, and asked him if he had lost his mind. I am trying to keep it, Sengoku said, and killed the lion so hard the snail flinched. Garp's fists tightened. Ace watched Shanks through the bars of his memory and the iron of the scaffold, a flood of images breaking at once. A village on Fuchsia with stories that changed the temperature of a room. A boy with a hat and a smile who believed promises more than plans. A glass raised to freedom and not to war. He felt pride and a pressure on his ribs that had nothing to do with chains. He had chosen his family, and that choice had put people in graves. The guilt he treated like a private wound yawned its mouth. Then he saw Luffy coming, and every thought in his head evaporated into a need so simple it could kill you. Get him out. The corridor to the scaffold became a throat for miracles and violence. Swords clanged, bullets screamed. The Pacifista's palms lit the air with lances that chewed stone into pebbles. Kuma's shadow swallowed a section of the melee and deposited it somewhere nobody could see. Doflamingo danced a puppet line through men who'd not known they were attached to strings until their wrists jerked and their futures snapped. Crocodile tossed sand into plans like a saboteur with dry hands. Even Buggy found a way to get adored, his severed head drifting over the crowd like a fallen idol revising its career. The broadcast leaned into every absurdity and horror because eyes stayed for contrast. Somewhere in that river of bodies, Kobe lost his breath. He had been shouting orders to men older and harder than him, using words he hoped would taste like leadership if he said them fast. He saw Luffy and forgot protocol. For a second, the war collapsed into the memory of a ship's deck and a rubber boy's compassion. Then Akainu's heat licked the edge of his awareness, and fear put a knife in his backbone to keep him standing. He would remember the feeling of that choice in his bones for the rest of his life. The midpoint tied itself in a knot of hope. After everything, through impossible threads woven by enemies and friends, Luffy reached the scaffold. He reached it with the last terrible stretch of a dreamer whose lungs had decided to become a separate species and leave his body. He reached it because men bled expensive seconds, and because some rivals had better things to prove, and because Shanks kept pulling the attention of monsters sideways. He reached it, and then he realized, you don't save a man with a name, you save a man with a lock. Mr. Three's candle wax hissed. Keys manifested. When the manacles fell and Ace's wrists burned with air, people who had held breath like a weapon finally exhaled, and that exhale changed the shape of the war. For one clean minute, it looked like an exit existed. Marco roared. Jozu laughed like granite cracking. Vista lifted his blades and regarded the Marines with pity for what was about to happen to them. Even Mihawk tilted his head like a man acknowledging an elegant trick he'd no interest in replicating. Sengoku's shoulders lowered a fraction. In a side room insulated from spray and heartbreak, the five elders leaned forward with predator stillness and said in unison, "No." Akainu heard them even without the snail. He saw Whitebeard's face, old but not yet a corpse. He saw Ace, alive. He saw a future filled with young idiots who would never fear a scaffold again. He made a choice that would cut through the day like a black line. He chased. His magma surged between Ace and the sea, shoulder-checking reality. He hurled himself not at Luffy, but through him, his fist blossoming in a thermal flower, too fast to dodge without premonition. Ace turned because love is faster than legs. He did not calculate angles. He did not think how the cameras would see it, or how bards would sing it. He put his brother behind his back and made his chest a shield, and the world prepared to learn the sound a human body makes when it loses a fight with a volcano. A red blade bit the heat, and the heat screamed. It should have been impossible for steel to bully magma, but Haki made new physics, and Will made new geometry. Shanks took the hit that would have killed Ace, his left side taking the brunt, coat catching fire, skin blistering so fast it jumped stages. He didn't cry out. His body sagged for one frame in the broadcast. His knee touched stone. He forced himself back upright because men were watching who needed to believe bones could lie for a while. He shoved Akainu's arm aside with steel wrapped in spirit, the move cutting his palm and slicing the edge of his lifespan by a day he'd miss someday. His shoulder screamed, and he ignored it. Blood crawled down his flank, saw the heat, and turned to garlands of steam. The crowd groaned as if punched in a single stomach. Ace stared at him with an expression that had no room for gratitude yet, because it was too full of confusion, and a guilt so sharp it could carve wooden ships into sculptures. Luffy's eyes shook. He reached towards Shanks and stopped himself because every instinct he had told him that touching would make something break. Garp stood up on the scaffold with the violence of a man standing up to a god. "Enough," he said. He did not mean the fight. He meant the day. Akainu did not hear him. He wrenched his arm and came again, because he believed in the momentum of hatred the way some men believe in sunrise. Shanks caught him again, but not cleanly. The heat found his ribs and put its brand there. He saw stars around the edges of his vision, bright as coins in black water. He knew how much deeper he could dig and what it would cost. He also knew something else now. An angle had opened that would not stay open. On the far side of the bay, the world's most dangerous opportunist stepped onto the stage with the timing of a thief watching a vault door click. Blackbeard swaggered over a lip of shattered ice with a new pride at his hip, a crew made of monsters who had learned to smile. A few men booed, most were too busy dying or trying not to. He lifted his head and inhaled the war like a heavy wine. He grinned, teeth like a picket fence around a secret, and saw two things he wanted held in one frame: the old man who owned the sea and the quaking of an era loosening its bolts. "Sa-ha-ha-ha," he said, and it sounded like someone scratching a scar that had never healed. Shanks felt him the way a man feels a storm through the soles of his feet. He watched Blackbeard's trajectory, saw it drawn in chalk across broken ice, lurch straight for Whitebeard. Make a theater of patricide, steal a power that was more noun than verb, and leave a headline seared into the world. He could stop it if he stepped away from Ace right now. He measured the distance like a duel, and his mind did something awful and responsible. It counted costs. Akainu moved again. Marines pressed with him, because leadership is a disease you catch through proximity. Pirates surrounded Luffy and Ace with curved knives and curved backs, because family is an architecture you build in idiot storms. Aokiji shifted as if to cut off a retreat route with sudden winter. Kizaru tapped a toe as if listening to a dance beat only he could hear, and then turned into it, ready to become an arrow fired at a moving target for the Elegy of Light. Sengoku's lips tightened, and his hand hovered over an order that would salt the day. Shanks chose. He drove his heel into the ground and made his haki expand like a shockwave, without edges. Men fell. Even admirals had to blink. The camera shook. He leaned forward and spoke to Akainu in a voice that did not lift or lower, but somehow filled the space like tidewater. "Pursue Whitebeard," he said. "Stop Blackbeard taking the sea. This one," he flicked his blade toward Luffy and Ace without looking, "is leaving with me in the way." Akainu's laugh was a cough of cinders. "You give me orders now?" "I give you an enemy who deserves you," Shanks answered, and then he turned and moved. He moved in a way that teetered on the edge of reckless. He moved as if his body had drawn lines on the map and decided to redraw them anyway. He put his back to Akainu and bet his life on a colleague's contempt for thieves. It was both foolish and brilliant, and the difference would become a chapter someone would argue about in classrooms. He sprinted on ice that screamed beneath his boots and aimed his life at Blackbeard. But he did not make it before the first horror. The Gura Gura no Mi's song is more vibration than sound, but everyone hears it. Whitebeard lifted his hand for the last time, like a builder fitting a final beam. Blackbeard reached him with the graceless hunger of a man who had never believed he would get to eat this well. The screen did not show the worst of it, not because the government spared the world, but because the cameramen were crying. When it was over, the old man lay like a mountain the sea had chosen to sleep with, and Blackbeard had a grin that was going to get a lot of men killed. Shanks felt it like a rib breaking, and did not let his stride falter. He striking slid the last meters, and met Blackbeard's joy with a blade that still smoked along the edge from magma. The quake broke his stance, and he remade it between frames. His sword kissed the air where Blackbeard's throat had been, and a patch of space screamed, and then healed, as if embarrassed. Blackbeard rolled his shoulder, eyes bright, hand humming with stolen power and something older. "Say ha ha ha," he breathed. "You look good in white red." "You look like a debt," Shanks said, and cut at the conversation. The fight did not belong to this era. It leaked into the one that was coming. Every exchange had a footnote no one could read yet. Shanks's hockey infested his blade with the aggressive politeness of a gentleman at war, and Blackbeard's new power turned the air into a carpeting hazard. The ground quaked in bad rhythm. Walls groaned. Ships moaned. Marines and pirates backed away, not because they were cowards, but because they were not suicidal enough to be audience to this. Aokiji split his attention between containing fallout and not dying. Kizaru got bored and decided not to shoot. The odds of hitting friend's number bored him too. Sengoku's fingers hovered over the order to shut down all feeds, and then he remembered propaganda cuts, both ways, and kept them on, because a world that sees who you fight sometimes forgives how you fight. While gods argued, mortals kept each other alive if they could. Marco screamed orders until his voice was a saw blade, and then screamed anyway. Vista parried Kizaru once, and his arms went numb, and he laughed because it meant he'd been a story for a second. Doflamingo pulled a marine captain he hated into a bullet, and smiled like a man who had just heard that a rival had died of embarrassment. Smoker turned into a weather front and pretended the pain in his side was wind. Kobe stumbled into a space between heartbeats where all the noise stopped, and his eyes opened very wide. He heard the war he would join for real one day, calling him by a name he had not earned yet. He took 2 steps forward and then ran somewhere else, because instinct sometimes knows the right cowardice. It should have ended here with a slaughter, but fate loves bargains with loopholes. 3 things happened at once. Shanks's blade found a groove in Blackbeard's guard that looked like an accident, and wasn't. He cut deep enough to make a memory. Akainu, redirecting on fury, chased not Ace, but opportunity, and met the Whitebeard remnants at a choke point where bricks remembered being mountains. He burned the choke, and then the mountains. And Luffy, who had been running out of self for the last hour, found himself shoved down a corridor of bodies by men whose choices were made and stumbled into a sightline with Kobe. And in that tiny exchange, the future got invited into the room. Kobe raised his arms and shouted a word that sounded insane on a battlefield. Stop. The word fell and broke. Akainu turned his head, lips shaping a lesson, and Shanks saw the line and made it a wall. He appeared between Akainu and the boy, his blade held low this time, as if every school of swordsmanship had lied, and the proper place for a weapon is where a hand would be if the weapon weren't there. He is a child, Shanks said. You want to be the government that kills a cadet on live broadcast because he asked you to think? Justice cannot audition, Akainu said, stepping in. Lava popped on his shoulder like punctuation. Justice can survive a breath, Shanks replied. The breath became a moment no one could quite define later. The cameras caught Shanks standing, coat ripped, hair burned in a charred pass down one side, eyes flat with the decision that clearly hurt him to carry. They caught Akainu, scowl shaved even sharper by confusion, heat halo humming. They caught Kobe, trembling legs, white face, eyes too big for the skull. And some people remembered being that age and making a choice that still visited them in the night. The world briefly forgot to take sides and just watched. Sengoku made the call because someone had to. "Cease fire," he said into the net, voice like an anchor. "Admiral Red is assuming control of the plaza. Any Marine who disobeys will answer to me." He met Garp's eyes, and they both looked down at the chains that lay on the scaffold like snakes that had died. Surprised. This ends now. It did not end neatly, because nothing worth watching ever does. Akainu snarled and pulled back, fists still molten with resentment and policy. Kizaru sighed, turned his finger into a spark he could keep in his pocket, and drifted into the nearest conversation like a lazy photon. Aokiji exhaled and put more frost into the bay, as if apologizing to the water for what his friends had done to it. The Pacifista line paused in eerie unison, heads cocked like patient predators denied meat for reasons they didn't need to understand. Warlords took inventory of whims. Pirates staggered toward their ships in a choreography that might have looked like retreat if your heart was hard enough. On the far side, Blackbeard laughed and decided he had eaten enough for a first course. He threw a last quake at the sky for applause and slouched off with his freak show. "Another day, Red," he called, grinning like a scar. "Another day and another history." Shanks did not answer. He memorized the gait and the curve of the grin like a man tracing an enemy's name on a knife. His side hurt in a way that suggested the pain would live with him. He let it. You should keep a souvenir when the day tried to ruin you, and failed. Ace sagged to his knees on deck planks that had not existed for him an hour ago. The adrenaline that had been renting his body moved out without paying, and left the place a mess. He looked at his hands, red welts on the wrists where wax and iron had had long conversations, and then at Luffy, whose grin was back and hideous because it was being held up by threads. "I'm sorry," Ace said, the words falling out wrong. "I'm sorry I made you come here. I'm sorry." Luffy grabbed his face and squashed his cheeks in with palms scarred by war's small teeth. "Shut up," he said, and laughed, and it sounded like a ship catching wind after a hopeless hour. "We're going home." Garp sat on the scaffold again and aged a decade in 30 seconds. He put his fist down on the planks so gently the wood sighed relief instead of splintering. Sengoku stood beside him and carried the weight of men who will be blamed by those who weren't there. He imagined the 5 elders making a list of names to move and names to break, and saw his own at the top in black ink. He pressed the snail's mouth open and said sentence and punctuation. "War's over." He meant today's. Shanks stepped forward, lifted his blade, not in threat but in statement, and the plaza obeyed. The broadcast caught him from below, smoke behind and sky a sheet above, and across the world people went still how statues go still. "Anyone who wants to keep fighting," he said, voice steady, "will be fighting me." He didn't shout. He didn't need to. What he had wasn't volume. It was gravity. The last skirmishes died in embarrassment. Doflamingo clicked his tongue and withdrew like a cat from a bath. Mihawk tilted his head toward Shanks in a gesture that could have been acknowledgement or the beginning of an essay he'd never write. Crocodile slid away to the edges where men make deals. Buggy managed to hold his audience even as he fled, because sometimes charisma is not a choice, but an illness. The Pacifistas turned their heads in eerie sync to watch Admiral Red's silhouette until their handlers told them to put their eyes away. Evacuation was a mess of tenderness and triage. Marco burned without burning to keep his men on their feet. Vista cut ropes without cutting flesh. Jozu stared at the place where his diamond had failed him and decided not to think about it for 20 years. Ace leaned into Luffy like a man who had found a wall that wouldn't fall while the house burned. Every step away from the scaffold felt like theft. Every step was necessary. When the Moby Dick's replacement ships pulled away from the ice-choked harbor, the camera lingered one beat too long on the shape of Whitebeard, lying like geography, and all the voices in the world lowered in respect or fear, or both. Then the broadcast cut to a studio where a man with lacquered hair tried to tell the world what it had just seen. Words like victory and regrettable losses and unprecedented leadership from Admiral Red lined up and marched out. The government would call it a success with messy edges. The pirates would call it a survival rehearsal. The citizens in the quieter East Blue towns called it a story they'd tell wrong to be less afraid when the sky cracked again. In a certain room, the 5 elders moved names on a board and placed Admiral Shanks under a lens that turned warmth into suspicion. One of them said quietly that the man had connections to undesirable variables, and another said kindly that knives cut meat and fingers both. Sengoku visited the medical wing that night and stood by Shanks's bed, watching the rise and fall of a chest bandaged like a map of rivers that had decided to meet. He did not ask the question he'd been asked to ask by men who wore decisions like gloves. He asked the one he had earned the right to ask. "Do you still believe in the uniform?" he murmured. Shanks opened one eye. "I believe in people I can look in the face," he said. "Uniform helps sometimes. Gets in the way sometimes. Today, it did both." "You saved Ace," Sengoku said. Shanks' mouth twitched. "I stopped you from making a kind of history we couldn't survive. Saving Ace was a side effect." Sengoku's laugh startled the night nurse. "You're terrible," he said. "I am injured," Shanks corrected. "Terrible tomorrow." They didn't talk about Blackbeard because there wasn't enough stiffness left in the air to hold that conversation. They didn't talk about Akainu because the man's heat would make any room dry out. They didn't talk about the 5 elders because some names kill sleep. On a deck in the night, Ace stared at the sky, so hard it should have impressed him with its honesty. Luffy snored like it was a job. Marco stood in the bow with his back pretending to hold up the horizon. The men spoke softly about the old man, using metaphors that leaked because no metaphor can hold a quake. Ace closed his eyes and saw Whitebeard's grin, and Shanks' burned coat, and the way Luffy had laughed with blood on his teeth. He did not cry yet. Grief was a tide, and he was not in a place where it could reach him without sinking his ship. Somewhere dark, Blackbeard held his new power with both hands, and laughed until his crew flinched. He felt the Gura Gura singing in his bones, and the Yami Yami's hunger humming quietly beneath. A low hunger like gravity that wanted to own verbs. He dreamed a map with his name on it in letters big enough to be seen from the moon. He placed pieces. He assigned betrayals. He put a red dot on a man in a white coat and a scarred face, and a sword that had tasted magma. On a tiny island where people repaired things and raised vegetables, a bartender turned off the din-din and breathed out a prayer he did not name. The wind brought him the smell of a hat he had not seen in years and would not see for years more. He told a boy to sweep the porch, and the boy did it badly, and the man hid a smile and a cough. Stories always came back here, even if men didn't. In the days that followed, paper became knives and numbers became accusations. Bounties tried to price guilt and faith, and failed gracefully. Ace's face in black ink wore a new number that said, "We cannot afford another rescue like that." Luffy's number got absurd on principle. Marco got a figure that would insult him into a laugh when he could laugh again. Buggy's bounty had a 0, someone would later claim, was a clerical error. Whitebeard's territories trembled, and then changed flags faster than maps could. Some islands went quiet for the first time in years and called it terrifying. Others got loud and called it freedom, while the loudest men took their fish. The Marines did ceremony badly because their hands were full of bandages and write-ups. They put medals where the cameras would find them, and memos where the 5 elders would. Akainu filed a report with language that blistered even on the page, and his signature looked like a wound. Aokiji sent in neat paragraphs, and then slept for 20 hours in a chair because people needed him to be made of the same material as shade. Kizuru played with a beam of light on his fingers, making it dance up walls, while a clerk tried to guess if he was mocking the paperwork, or light, or both. Kobe stared at his hands and did not quite shake. Helmeppo told him a bad joke until Kobe made a sound that could have been a laugh if you put it in the right room. Admiral Shanks went back to work because work was easier than thinking. He inspected a new line of recruits and told 2 of them to go home before war used them up like candles. He visited the families of men whose names would slide down lists as budgets got made and said their names into rooms that hadn't heard enough of them. He trained in an empty yard with a bandaged hand and a blade that remembered heat, and a younger swordsman watched him through a window and learned 5 things without knowing which 2 would keep him alive someday. He sat alone once in his office while Knight laid out a map of the islands on his desk and asked himself aloud if he had traded one kind of law for another, or simply painted a different word on his stubbornness. He decided not to decide yet. News spread like tide and rumor like wind. Fishermen in the North Blue said that if you listened to the hull at night, you could hear the sea remembering a fist. A child in Alabasta drew a picture of a man with red hair carrying 2 boys under his arms like sacks of flour, and no one corrected her because the drawing fixed something a sentence couldn't. Warlords counted and pretended it was art. Islands that had never seen a marine coat that wasn't stained thunderstorm gray now saw white and didn't know whether to cheer. Revolutionary ears pricked to a rhythm they'd recognize anywhere, a boy whose laughter survived war. Dragons stared at a wall until it admitted it was a map. Somewhere, on a ship that smelled like clean wood and slept grief in shifts, Ace stood on the rail and held the wind like a man asking it for a favor he hadn't earned. He closed his eyes and said, "I won't waste it." Luffy behind him yawned a promise back without knowing he was making one. The sea rolled its old eyes and prepared to hold them both up as long as it could. And in a quiet corner of Marineford, a sword cooled at last, and a man with burned ribs tied his coat on again, knowing the next time he raised his blade, the world would measure the angle of his wrist for signs of treachery. While in a tavern a continent away, someone lifted a cup and said a name that would be said differently from now on, and deep under the rocking of a black ship, a man with too many laughs put pins in a map and drew a line toward a red dot that meant trouble and tomorrow, and the sea adjusted her heartbeat by a fraction to see who would listen. Night pressed a low ceiling over the shattered bay as repair crews moved like ants under collapsed ribs of wall, and icebergs groaned around the harbor like tired beasts. Floodlights threw pale cones across the plaza, bleaching blood to gray and making every breath look like smoke. A medic's whistle cut once, sharp. A stretcher lifted. A Marine private whispered a prayer that wasn't in the handbook. Out on the water, ships rocked against the ice, pirate silhouettes limping for the gap Aokiji had finally opened under orders, and for a few minutes, all the hate in the world sounded like ropes creaking through Fairleads. Admiral Shanks stood at the edge of the quay with a coat over bandages, not moving. As welders stitched the siege wall back together, and a crane lowered a new iron slab with the patience of geology. The pain in his side pulsed in long waves that matched the swells. He let it, measuring the rhythm until it became another beat to work to. Adendin's eye blinked red at his hip. He ignored it until the third blink. He lifted the receiver, and the room on the other end answered with 3 men and a glare polished by centuries. "Your theater was expensive," one of the 5 elders said, voice a clean blade. "We count ships like teeth in a mouth we paid for." "You got a war you can sell," Shanks replied, watching sparks rain from a cutting torch. "And fewer ghosts attached to it. You're welcome." "Your unwillingness to let a necessary example stand will force other examples later," another elder said. "Your name will be attached to their invoices." "Attach it," Shanks said, and closed the line as a gull skated the air over the bay with idiotic grace, unaware that men had argued about history below it like it was a bill. He stood there until the cold worked into his bones, and then longer, eyes on the ragged light trail of the last Whitebeard ship slipping through ice like a wound sealing. On that ship, a funeral began without speech. Men brought out sake as if pouring from that bottle might make a hole in the ocean big enough for a giant, and for a second, it looked like it did. Marco stood with hands braced on the rail, blue flicker faint around his shoulders, as if the phoenix couldn't decide whether to flame and scare the grief out of them, or go quiet and let it sit. Jozu put the Bacento's broken half across the wooden crate, like a mast for a smaller ship, the steel heavy enough to bend the planks into a shallow sigh. Vista took off his hat. Ace came last, because he had slept only when his body tricked him to, and he looked like a rope used too hard, then coiled tenderly. He set a cup on the crate, liquid shivering with the ship, and whispered a word only he and the night heard. Luffy nudged his shoulder with childish gentleness, eyes puffy and bloodshot, and somehow still bright. "Old man still loud," Luffy murmured, as if the ocean were listening for tone. "He's probably yelling at us for how ugly we look when we cry." Ace almost laughed, held halfway by a hitch that was honesty, and exhaled the first breath that wasn't a debt since the scaffold. Slow pan. Mary Jawaz swept under daylight that didn't touch anything below the dome. Holy banners hung like verdicts. Servants flitted in white, invisible until the moment their invisibility didn't work. CP agents carried files that smelled like ink and rubber, and the small relief of a clipped corner aligning perfectly. The 5 elders sat angled to a Denden feed, replaying Shanks walking into a magma storm to separate a boy from policy. The image froze on his burned profile. One elder tapped the frame idly with a pen. "He answered to the moment, not the order," the bald one said. "That can make you love a man on a battlefield and hate him in a ledger." "Fine," the one with the birthmark murmured. "Move a piece. If he insists on being the Marine the public imagines when they need a story to sleep to, assign him the duty those stories can't stomach. Sabaudy's next celestial convoy. Put him in white silk mud deep. We'll see whether he drags more pirates to it or keeps them out without punching a godling." "Dangerous," the swordsman said. "And useful." The pen tapped again, gentle as raindrops. "And what of Sengoku?" "Let him resign," said the elder, whose smile always looked like a receipt. "A peaceful hand passes the baton. A firm hand catches it. We name a fleet admiral who will not blink where Red did. They did not say Akainu. They didn't have to. The din-din at the corner of the desk logged the note for a meeting that would happen in a room with chairs too hard and tea too hot. Back at Marineford, the wards turned with the quiet rhythm of competent people healing what they could. Shanks woke to Mihawk, sitting in a chair like he owned furniture by right of posture. The warlord had a book in one hand and the other resting on the hilt that had nicked light earlier. He didn't look up. Your nurse tried to deny me entry, he said. She is terrifying. She is underpaid, Shanks answered, rolling his shoulder and feeling the ache like a loyal dog lying across a rib. You came to check if I'm still symmetrical. I came to see if I'd lost my rival to politics, Mihawk said, closing the book with consideration. You continued to refuse to be one thing. Hypocrisy from a swordsman who accepted a government's leash to sleep comfortably, Shanks teased. Comfort is a knife, Mihawk said mildly. I keep mine sharp. He stood, looked at Shanks the way a craftsman inspects a plank for hidden rot, and flicked his gaze at the window where dawn tried and failed to be heroic through construction dust. You're playing two games with one blade. It will break, he said, not unkindly. Then I'll borrow yours, Shanks said, and actually got a smile out of him. Sengoku's resignation didn't break like news. It settled across the fleet like heavy weather, inevitable once you read the sky. He delivered it with the implacable grace of a man who had been columns and numbers for a lifetime, and now wanted to be a person again, even if it meant new pain. In his office, with the smell of papers and old tea, Garp laughed so he wouldn't punch the wall, then sighed so the wall could survive. They'll put the hot one in the big chair, Garp said. He'll try to iron the ocean. Maybe the ocean needs a little ironing, Sengoku said, though his eyes were elsewhere, replaying Kobe lifting his arms like a fool, and Shanks stepping between heat and youth with the most maddening common sense anyone had shown all day. Maybe it burns the shirt instead. Aokiji watched the politics moving, as if he had the patience to see glaciers turn, and the ache to wish they wouldn't. Kizaru watched and wondered if the light ever got bored with the games men made it play. Akainu watched and saw the end of dithering. His report was precise and accusatory. It used phrases like sedition by sentiment and adverse precedent, and the softness that breeds future conflagrations. When the reply arrived requesting a private meeting to discuss his vision of justice, the page smelled faintly of oil and the sea and victory deferred. He smiled without his mouth. The convoy order hit Shanks's desk with the weight of silk. It was written in polite language that told a nasty story. Escort 3 world nobles through Sabaody to a transponder-equipped luxury ship under heightened pirate activity. Ensure the island's grooves remain clear of illegal entertainment. And, without saying it, restrain his own conscience in front of cameras. He read it twice and set it down like something warm that might burn through if you held it wrong. I need the roster, he said to the lieutenant, who tried not to flinch. No Kizaru. He makes people worse without saying a word. We can't assign Aokiji. He's... The lieutenant shut out his mouth. Understood. Bring Hina, Shanks said. She's steel with manners. And Kobe. Sir? The name hit the room like a dropped spoon. He saw the day, Shanks said quietly. Let's teach him how to walk in it without drowning. Sabaody looked cleaner than it was under sun, its roots drinking the past while bubbles rose with childish denial. The celestial dragons arrived with the convincing certainty of people who had never had to convince anyone of anything, their helmets reflecting a distorted world where no one else's face was allowed to be a mirror. Their guards fanned out, indifferent to the tension, because tension was for other people. Shanks walked 2 steps behind the lead palanquin and 1 step aside, the geometry of a shield that pretends not to be one. Hina whispered orders that made Marines feel like professionals and not cudgels. Kobe scanned the crowd with eyes that had learned how far a scream could travel and how near a bullet could be when you realize you're just a person. Trouble arrived in waves rather than a single stone. First, a fight in Grove 24 as a slaver tried to turn a desperate man into a package, and Shanks's presence made the slaver's courage shrivel like a leaf held too close to a flame. Second, a band of upstart pirates with more tattoos than experience decided that staining a celestial cape would become an origin story. Hina's iron ribbons kissed their wrists before ambition could get expensive. Third, a masked figure on the roofs, sliding along cables like a spider with somewhere to be. CP0, faceless and efficient, testing how much a man in a white coat would let the world see. Shanks let the mask pass and made a note of the gate. There would be other nights to cut it off. The worst threat was a boy with his jaw set and a gun he wasn't old enough to have stolen yet. He raised it with the martyr's steady hand and aimed at a bubble where a noble's mouth would be in a human world. Cutaway. Crowd eyes widen. Kobe moved first without explanation to himself, intercepting the line with his shoulder because muscles were faster than ethics. The bullet nicked off his pauldron and spun away into a tree with a sound like a finger snap. The boy's eyes brimmed with confusion that had no room for gratitude. Shanks's voice landed in the space. "Look at me," he said. The boy did. "You want to break a system, not your life. Go home before you give them a reason to name you." The boy swallowed the urge to scream, then swallowed the gun, in pieces, into a bag, then swallowed his pride with more dignity than most men achieve in a decade, and vanished. Shanks let out a breath only when the palanquin moved on. Hancock saw all of it from the shade of a grove where her presence made sailors forget posture long enough to remember being alive. She watched Shanks escort monsters with restraint so explicit it might as well have been a confession, and decided she would tell no one she had found a Marine admirable for an hour. Rayleigh drank invisible in the same shade, eyes twinkling under hair that refused to obey time. "Interesting," he said, because he loved that word when the world stopped making sense with boring effort. "That boy you like will read this day, like a book in a language he shouldn't know yet." Luffy did. From the safety of Amazon Lily's impossible law, his body stitching itself back together under food and scolding, he watched the broadcast of Shanks moving through Sabaody with a convoy of sins and Marines not being monsters on purpose that day. He put 2 fingers to his chest, and for a second, between meals big enough to injure and naps that anchored him to the island's gravity, he closed his eyes and heard a drum again, the rhythm faint, but not gone, as if the world had a heart he could borrow if he paid in pain. He opened his eyes and said aloud, fierce and simple, "I'm not ready." And Hancock pretended she hadn't heard him because her own heart couldn't take that sort of humility in something so loud. Jinbe nodded and smiled like a reef. He had been waiting to hear that exact sentence. Ace, leaning in the doorway with a bandage he refused to replace because changing it every hour made it feel like he was indulging the wound, took a breath and let it turn into something like relief. Good, he said. Then don't be stupid. Luffy pointed at himself with both thumbs. I'm always stupid, he grinned. I'll be less stupid for a while. When Rayleigh arrived later to offer training that turned time into a favor and pain into a plan, Shanks felt the tremor of that decision without knowing the details, as if the ocean itself had sent him a memo in a language he'd learned on docks and decks. He wrote one of his own. The message went to every island administrator under his umbrella. Prioritize civilians when borders change hands. When you cannot protect trade, protect fishermen. When the decision is law versus life, lean toward life and write me a justification. I can throw on a table hard enough to make it sound like common sense. The replies came back in a melange of gratitude, confused compliance, and discreet objections that had the scent of career survival. He signed them all with a short line. The uniform is for them, not the other way around. Blackbeard made good use of the breathing space. He didn't lunge for the biggest, brightest islands with the idiot candor of a child stealing fireworks. He took soft edges first, villages whose loyalty had been to Whitebeard's punctual storms, not to his flag. He offered protection with a rate sheet and a grin, and when someone said no, he showed them what a quake felt like in their bones, so their children would remember to say yes faster. Word traveled faster than boats. When it reached Shanks's desk, it felt like a bruise pressed by a thumb. He took a detail on ostensibly routine patrol and steered them 3 degrees off course until a stubborn little island called Kantala fell into view, roofs red against a green cliff, a harbor like a half smile. Smoke made a thin line on the sky. Fresh, a question. They found Teach there, of course, because fate likes a sense of humor. He was standing in the square as if he'd bought it, foot on the lip of a well, townspeople arranged around him like an audience too polite to boo. His crew lounged like forest fires in chairs they'd taken, their laughter oil. Shanks stepped into the square without ceremony. Hina beside him with iron like a promise. Kobe fully aware that his heart could sprint faster than his legs. Zehahaha, Teach greeted, tipping an imaginary hat. Marine hospitality keeps getting better. My hospitality has rules, Shanks said. Get off the island and take your price list with you. Teach made a show of thinking, cocking his head so the scars on his face made lines like bad maps. No. The square became geometry, the well a hazard, the bakery wall an anchor, the fountain a reflector. Shanks angled his stance so a quake would break itself on empty air and not on a child's skull. He spoke without glancing back. Hina, keep them from turning the houses into coffins. Yes, she said, and turned her subordinates into a net with her voice alone. Blackbeard made a quake with his fist, like a punchline, and Shanks slid inside the fracture, blade humming. Slow-mo impact. Again, but different. Not grandeur this time, a practical violence that respected everything around it while trying to kill what was in front. Their exchange was brutally economical. Shanks cut where it would change the next 5 moves, not the current one. Teach threw power like a man tossing grenades just to hear the sound. Kobe moved civilians like a mad shepherd, learning how to shout instructions that made panicked people smart. One of Blackbeard's freaks tried the back lane with a knife's idea of subtlety. Hina nailed him to sense with iron, in a glance that made him reconsider the career that had brought him here. The fight shifted when darkness crawled out of Teach's hand like spilled ink, and gravity in the square remembered it had always wanted to be greedier. Shanks tasted the Yami's drag again and felt how it liked him, the way quicksand likes legs. Zee-ha-ha-ha. Teach wheezed when their blades kissed too close, and Shanks shoved him by the shoulder into the well's coping, stone crunching. You play cop now, Red? Keeping markets open for a world that likes chains. I pull people out of holes, Shanks said, stepping hard off the well so the quake line staggered into empty air. Everything else is politics and not my favorite drink. He drove a cut that would have been decisive if Teach's coat hadn't belched darkness like an animal reflex. The blade stuck for a hateful half-second, and in that half-second, Teach's fist almost found Shanks' ribs. Shanks turned enough to turn a lethal into a lesson. The punch took him high on the shoulder, where pain lives longer but costs less. He winced in a way that would burn for hours. Teach laughed because he had injured something men liked. Keep your island, he said to the terrified mayor, as if granting benediction. For now. Then to Shanks, pausing at the square's edge, voice fond and cruel. Every time you save something small, you make room for me someplace big. Thank you. He left, earth juddering under his crew's boots, like the island couldn't decide whether to keep them or spit them out. Kobe exhaled hard enough to nearly fall, knees recalling their previous career as soft. I thought He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Shanks clapped his shoulder gently, making sure the boy's bones stayed organized. He wanted an argument, Shanks said. We gave him paperwork. That infuriates men like him. By the time Shanks got back to headquarters, the chairs had moved. Sengoku's portrait stared from the wall with the faint bewilderment every portrait develops after being orphaned. Akainu stood behind the Fleet Admiral desk like he'd been grown there, jawline a straight edge. He welcomed Shanks with a nod that felt like a dismissal, calibrated to be legal. I will require compliance, he said, with no tone at all, which was more biting than contempt. You'll get it when orders make sense, Shanks returned, dropping a file on the desk with a map of Kantala and 3 letters describing what's left after tectonics flirt with murder. And when they don't, you'll get noise. We can learn to like each other's music. Your music makes soldiers think, Akainu said, as if diagnosing a disease. They hesitate when they should obey. They hesitate when they should decide, Shanks countered. They obey when it counts. Akainu's eyes narrowed, as if a sun had flared behind his pupils. We will see, he said. Aokiji watched the exchange from the doorway, his breath fogging a little more than the room demanded. He had already decided to lose one war for the hope of winning another, and would one day make that choice formal on an island that still smells like hot stone. Kizaru wandered past with a whistle that somehow managed to mock gravity and bureaucracy in the same note. Garp ate a rice cracker loudly down the hall and pretended he'd lost his hearing in the war. Across the world, Luffy stood under the bell at Marineford's ruin, not by stealth this time, but by permission bought with favors and sentiment, and hid it until his arms shook and his grin cried. The sound went up and out through the world's canals and into its kitchens. It said 2 years in a language stronger than numbers. It said, don't come. Get stronger. Forgive me. I will be back like a tide. Newspaper birds dropped editions with the image of a boy and a bell and a hat that had come out of a marine's silhouette years ago, and under it a line that would confuse some and organize others. See you on the other side. Rayleigh watched from a shadow and nodded like a teacher who had written the exam. Ace watched and did not shatter. He had made peace with the insult of survival, and now he would make good on its cost. He would become fire that guarded as much as it burned. Shanks lifted a cup in a quiet bar the night after the bell and let the cheap sake sit on his tongue until it grew honest. He was surrounded by men and women who would have saluted if they'd recognized him, which was why he was glad they didn't. He set the cup down with the decisiveness of a man closing a chapter and opened a new file on his lap with the decisiveness of a man admitting chapters aren't real. It was a CP brief, glossy and obscene, about a program to replace Shichibukai with clean instruments. He skimmed phrases like cybernetically augmented and cost-effective compliance and deniable deployment, and closed his eyes until the words dissolved into their shapes. Fear dressed as progress. He put the file under his chair and one boot on it. He stayed like that for a long time, heel heavy, as if pressure could transmit through paper into rooms he couldn't enter without losing something he wanted to keep. Mihawk sent no message, but nodded from a cliff days later, when Shanks happened to look up from a patrol ship at the exact wrong right moment. Their eyes met for a second across a gap too large for any rope, and the nod said the only thing worth saying, "Not yet." Doflamingo laughed somewhere hot and called Dressrosa a laboratory. His strings twitched at newsprint words like Admiral and Reform, because he knew diets don't kill appetites. Crocodile scraped sand through fingers and felt it clump with water he didn't own, and thought about deserts that used to be rivers. Buggy thrived because the dangerous trick of history is that it loves clowns when they trip over treasures. And Blackbeard drew lines across the new world like a drunk cartographer, circles around islands where the old man's markers had bled, arrows toward places where the Marines would be thin, because peace looks like a good budget line until the sea reminds you it hates plans. His laughter carried over water because men kept telling stories in taverns, and monsters hear stories like dinner bells. When he laid down in a hammock he had taken from a captain who no longer needed hammocks, he dreamed of a red blade, and the dream made him smile with all his teeth, because he had seen in Shanks's eyes something he could use, a man who cared enough to choose, and choices have edges you can attack. Morning after morning, Shanks tied on the white coat, not because it fit his back, but because the people who looked at it needed what it promised when an admiral decided to tell the truth with his body. He signed orders he hated and ignored orders he couldn't justify, and wrote addendums that would make clerks drink at lunch. He trained until the scar under his ribs stopped tugging and started teaching. He visited the recruit yard and paired Kobe with a swordsman who would not go easy on him, then stepped in himself when the boy's form went from noble to nonsense. "Shorten your steps," he said, tapping Kobe's ankle with the scabbard. "Don't make your courage stand in for your balance." Kobe nodded like a man engraving, sweat stinging his eyes. Somewhere in his blood, a new sense stretched like an animal after a nap, and liked the yard. Shanks saw the shiver travel through him and smiled. "Good. Learn the feeling. Don't talk about it. People ruin new things when they name them too soon." The world rolled its old shoulders and tested the hinges of a new era. There were mornings when flags from Whitebeard's territory came down, and banners nobody recognized went up with less stabbing than feared, and afternoons when a village burned because a crew with a grandiose name had to justify its adjective. There were nights when the Marines arrived before the second scream, and nights when they didn't arrive at all because the unit had been reassigned to guard a noble's wine collection. On one such night, Shanks stood on a balcony outside the Fleet Admiral's office and watched rain stitch vertical lines into the courtyard, and Akainu stood inside reading a report that listed numbers like deaths of ideas, and both men admitted a thing in private: they'd never give each other the gift of hearing. This is too big for any one conviction. Out on the Grand Line, under a sky that had learned again how to look like a ceiling and not an open mouth, a hat hung on a peg in a shack on Fuchsia Village, and a boy's promise aged by a year of salt and a day of war waited for the hand that had left it. And out beyond that, further than maps. If you sailed by rules, closer than breath. If you sailed by stubbornness, the sea whispered a new rumor in ports and brothels and temples and barracks at once. The marine in white with a pirate's smile had drawn a line no one expected and dared the world to decide what it made of that line, while a man with a laugh like a broken lock had taken a dead giant's fist and promised to use it on the roof of the age. And somewhere between those two edges, a straw hat boy pounded the earth with his bare feet in a jungle older than maps, learning how to make his laughter into armor without dropping it on the ground, as the era inhaled deeply like a fighter, just before swinging again. The rain broke at dawn and left Marineford smelling like iron and wet rope. Work crews stacked rubble into neat griefs, and the bay pushed at the ice with a patient shoulder until the floes sighed themselves apart. Shanks walked the perimeter with a clipboard he didn't need, and the ache of half-healed ribs that reminded him when to slow down, which he ignored until Hina stood in front of him with a look that outranked 1,000 memos. He took the hint and sat on a bollard while welders stitched the siege wall, and for a minute the world around him was just sparks, hiss, and the soft scold of tide against stone. He listened for the sound of a drum that didn't belong to machines, the rhythm he'd heard too close to a straw hat, but the only beat was the pulse in his side and the city's tired breathing. The next days layered like lacquer. Orders, escort, rebuild, review, reports, casualties, commendations, compromises, rumors, Akainu promoted, Aokiji considering, Kizaru unchanged by anything but leisure. The celestial convoy assignment came down like a silk-wrapped trap, and he walked it anyway, through Sabaody's sideways light and varnished cruelty, because stepping away would leave the job to someone who liked this kind of power. He deflected a dozen collisions without drawing blood on camera, let Hina's iron do the quiet work, and taught Kobe to put his body between a wrong and a catastrophe. He gave a slaver a look that dried courage on the tongue. He let a CP0 mask pass and memorized the gate. He told a child with a gun to go home before becoming a reason. When the palanquins vanished into a cordon dock and the luxury hull swallowed sin whole, Shanks exhaled the kind of breath you only realize you were holding when it scrapes your throat raw on the way out. He chased Blackbeard off a village that smelled like flour and rope, exchanging practical violence in a square with a well, and a baker who would never like thunder again. He took a punch on the shoulder instead of the ribs, and added a new ache to the choir. He watched Teach grin and leave, because dinner tastes better on plates you set yourself, and he logged a note. Do not let him choose the battlefield again. He delivered that file to a desk that had been Sengoku's and was now Akainu's, and stood with his weight off his left leg, because pride didn't need to bleed on the new fleet admiral's carpet. They spoke like weather systems. Heat across cool, rain over ash. We will require discipline, Akainu said. You'll get outcomes, Shanks answered, and both believed they were talking about the same thing, which was the funniest lie the building had seen all week. The sea kept making introductions he didn't have time for. Kaido sniffed at the edge of marine jurisdiction like a storm testing inland, a vanguard of beasts with grins that didn't understand the word negotiation, set their prow toward an outpost with too few guns. Shanks took 3 ships and his sword and put himself between horns and uniforms. The first exchange was a test disguised as contempt. An Oni-sized lieutenant dragging an iron club through gravel with a sound like a bridge dying. They met on a spit of rock that would be a sandbar by nightfall. Hockey crackled along steel. The club came down like a verdict. Shanks stepped half a foot and a lifetime left, blade kissing the club's ribs, and the force rolled off into the sea in a hiss that made fish reconsider their careers. He didn't aim to kill. He aimed to adjust momentum without waking a monster with a drinking problem. The lieutenant laughed until his nose broke on the second parry, and then remembered that laughter doesn't fix everything. The vanguard peeled away because a single man with red hair, standing in front of the boring flag of law, had said no with his body, and some creatures still respect that language. Kaido himself didn't bite. He had other cliffs to jump off that day. Shanks watched the silhouettes shrink, shoulder throbbing, and let the Marines behind him breathe out admiration that tasted too much like relief. Then came the duel that wasn't his, and he hated how much he felt it. Punk Hazard stank of chemical ghosts and fresh geology. Rumors of a challenge ran down the line like an electrical fault. Okiji sent no letter. Kizaru sent a joke. Akainu sent himself. Shanks stared at the chart table for a long time, with a knot under his sternum, and Garp's silent in the chair by the door like furniture. "If you go," Garp said finally, "you make it worse. If you don't, you might hate yourself." Shanks nodded once. He did neither, and both. He read the reports as they came like weather updates, each one a bruise. Heat bloom, cold front, island splitting. He stepped out of a meeting when a line came through that made the snail shake with exhaustion after carrying it. Okiji down. He put his hand on the window frame and watched sunlight lie about the temperature. Okiji visited a week later with a limp and a smile that made flowers close. "Watch your back," Kuzan said, eyes soft with an exhaustion that didn't touch his humor. "You're interesting now in a way that gets people reorganized." "I've been interesting my whole life," Shanks said. "Now you're a file," Kuzan replied, and left a chill behind that would haunt the office carpets until the cleaners complained. Akainu moved headquarters forward because volcanoes don't stay put, and he wasn't going to either. G1 swelled, G5 got meaner, and the New World woke to find a lawman where it had kept a wolf and taught itself the difference. Smoker chased pirates with a competence that looked like irritation from a distance. Tashigi gathered swords into a gentle wrath. Shanks visited their sector to inspect, and found himself on a dock that had been carved into obedience by bad weather, sharing a cigarette with Smoker and a story with Tashigi about a sword that wanted to be better than its wielder. "They'll replace the warlords with something uglier," Smoker said flat. "Something that looks good in a ledger." "Paper is brave," Shanks said. "Steel is braver. We'll see which they bring." Tashigi bowed slightly, more for the blade slung across her back than the man in front of her. "I'll keep taking the bad ones away," she said, "even if the list grows teeth." "Good," Shanks said. "Let it bite you, where you have armor." He spoke to Ace once over a snail, an unlisted line that made two men ignore their chains for 3 minutes. The voice on the other side was rough with making promises to ghosts and waking to keep them. "I won't waste what you bought," Ace said. "Don't build me a debt I can't pay," Shanks replied, "because heroism rots when you pretend it's a gift. Keep your people off evacuation corridors. I'll keep my people off your quiet islands. We both go for Blackbeard when he makes himself available." "He'll make himself everywhere," Ace said. "Then we'll be patient," Shanks said, and hung up before the conversation turned sentimental enough to get someone killed later. 2 years went by as if someone had taken a knife to a map and cut out the boring parts. On Amazon Lily, a boy carved into a man until both bled and both laughed. In the New World, a crew with a flag bearing a mustache learned to hold territory with mercy without getting eaten. In a lab no one sane visits, a scientist wrote the word Pacific above a blueprint, and then crossed it out because it would be a lie. In Mary Joie's, a teacup cracked when set down too hard during a briefing about public relations, and nobody mentioned it while everyone remembered it. Shanks trained when no one watched and turned in paperwork that made auditors furious with the accuracy of its insolence. He ignored invitations to parties where men pretended to enjoy power with fruit salads. He spent those evenings in bars that smelled like forgiveness and fish, listening to dock workers argue about the weather because it reminded him of the only politics he trusted. The Straw Hats reassembled because gravity had a sense of humor, and Rayleigh knew how to set an appointment with destiny. Sabaody held its breath as bubbles rose with embarrassed joy. Marines got very busy in exactly the wrong places, and by accident or elaborate plan, very unbusy where it mattered. A CP0 mask watched 3 imposters get beaten into lessons and wrote in a notebook that would never see the sun. Shanks was not there, and that absence was a presence. An admiral's signature on a patrol schedule rerouted 2 units to a training exchange 3 groves away. A stern memo on engagement priority, civilian safety, landed on a captain's desk like a net. A phone call to Hina said nothing on paper, and everything was silence. The crew slipped out from under the island's bad habit of turning reunions into catastrophes and slid into the current Rayleigh had drawn for them with a finger. A Marine ensign thought he saw a red shadow on the cusp of the grove as the Thousand Sunny vanished and smiled in a way he'd deny if asked. Blackbeard pressed harder. He cracked an island called Palomar with a joke and a stomp, and installed a governor made of scar tissue and greed. He took a port that had traded rum and weather for a century and turned it into a ledger with men's names in the margin. He sent letters to men who shouldn't open his mail, and enough of them did to make the next 2 years hell for coastlines. Shanks mapped him not by raids, but by absences. Places Teach didn't hit because he was building something more boring and dangerous than stories. He's triangulating supply, Hina said, tapping convoy lines. He's building endurance, Shanks said. We should cut the knees, not the head, while the head is smug. They tried at Baltigo and missed. Too many masks in the jungle. Too many hands on the same knife. They tried at Cantor's Reef and bled a patrol to keep barrels out of a cave that would have fed a year of sieges. They tried at Barrow's Forge and found only a note pinned to a dock post with a fishbone. Zeh-ha-ha-ha. Hina tore it off with gloved fingers as if laughter could stick to skin. Shanks pocketed it because arrogance carries fingerprints. When the reverie came, the world feigned dignity and wore cologne. Banners snapped. Carpets insulted stone. Kings and queens argued safely under guards who would kill children for reach and called that security. Shanks stood at the edge of the room like a painting that had learned to breathe. He listened to proposals that would outsource conscience to machines and applauses that sounded like coins. He spoke once, the way a man uses a match in fog. If you replace men with weapons you can throw away, you will throw away men faster. The 5 elders did not glare. They nodded and used politer knives. Your concerns are noted, one said. We would like you to demonstrate the new deterrence utility in a limited action against a regrettably lawless island cluster. Shanks looked down at the file. SSG, 3 silhouettes, mass-produced menace with polished bolts, and saw a future that ate its own teeth. "No," he said gently, "not like this." "Then escort the convoy," the elder said, sliding him back into a safer cruelty. He did, hating himself just enough to stay. One night in the New World, storms braided themselves into a rope and tried to pull two fleets into each other for fun. Blackbeard cut through the rain with an umbrella he stole from a dead man's hospitality and found a convoy of grain guarded by Marines who knew they'd die protecting bread. Shanks arrived with 3 ships because math isn't courage, but it helps. The first minutes were a metronome of cannon fire and thunder, and then the sea tried to climb into the sky and teach clouds to drown. Teach laughed with his chest, and the Gora answered, a sound that makes wood tell the truth about its fear. Wide shot. Waves like moving buildings. Shanks angled his flagship so the swell would carry debris away from the slowest transport. He told Hina to cut moorings on the far side to give the convoy room to run. He pointed his blade at a spot where a quake would prefer to break and leaned on physics with personality. Teach came in swinging because his victories had started to look like habits. They met on a deck that tilted like a drunk beast. They hacked seconds out of chaos for their soldiers to stand inside. "You always pick lives," Teach shouted over rain and the fat cough of a cannon. "Makes you soft." "Makes me heavy," Shanks said, sliding inside a swing, steel-tapping knuckles that thought they were rocks. "Harder to move." "I'll go around you." Teach smirked and hurled a quake at a ship carrying children whose parents had decided famine was worse than pirates. Shanks could have taken Teach's jaw with the cut he had in hand. He turned and cut the air instead, a hockey-wrapped line that split the wave at its knee. The transport slid through the seam with a sailor's prayer and a child's hiccup. Teach hit him in the ribs a breath later because honesty is expensive, and Shanks let the pain burn his eyes clear. "See?" Teach crowed. "Always the wrong choice for winning." "Always the right one for sleeping," Shanks said, and drove him back 3 paces with a flurry so precise it made the storm feel slovenly. They saved the convoy, and Blackbeard got away intact and amused, both of which counted as losses. Marines cheered because bread made it home. Shanks went below deck and threw up seawater and blood and relief into a bucket because bodies demand ritual. He sat there with his head against a bulkhead, heartbeat loud as a drum he didn't want touching his narrative, and laughed once, bad and good at the same time. Hina stood in the door and said nothing, because the silence did the job. When word came that the Straw Hats had broken out of Fishman Island's history and into the sky of the New World with a promise under their keel, Shanks felt the world tilt a degree to the version he liked living in. When news followed that they had walked into a cake and out of a Yonko's kitchen without dying, he tapped a pen twice on a map because he loved audacity more than he hated paperwork. When a rumor whispered that a certain swordsman had crossed blades with green resolve and both had survived with compliments, he smiled like a scar healing. Akainu called him in to discuss decorum after the convoy. "You let him go," the fleet admiral said, and the words had heat. "I kept children breathing," Shanks said, and the words had weight. They stared at each other across the desk that had seen more history than some islands. "We are not librarians," Akainu said finally. "We do not guard stories. We guard order." "We guard people," Shanks said. "Stories do that too." "Your sentiment is a liability," Akainu snapped. "Your certainty is a weapon pointed the wrong way," Shanks said, not raising his voice. Kizaru drifted past the open door, whistling something that turned the hallway into a question. The new weapons rolled out anyway, because no story can stop a budget with a uniform. They glinted in hangars and aboard ships, and their eyes glowed with a color that said, never tired, and always available, and no funeral costs. Shanks trained squads to stand between those machines and blood when a mistake got curious. He wrote doctrine for humane deployment that read like handcuffs braided into a manual. He signed his name to it and tasted bile. Kobe grew taller and steadier and learned to keep a secret his face had once been bad at. He could hear the breath of moments when choices arrived too early for orders. He used that sense to move a platoon left in a village whose street curled like a question mark. The house that would have collapsed missed them and killed a cart instead. He didn't tell anyone why he'd moved. Shanks saw the footprints after and said only, "Good. Keep your ears open. Don't get superstitious." "Yes, sir," Kobe said, and didn't mention that sometimes hearing the war felt like hearing a future sigh. Ace built a network that smelled like smoke and loyalty. He put men on islands the government didn't care about and told them to fix roofs and kill only when someone showed up wearing laughter like a knife. He broke 3 of Blackbeard's supply lines and lost a brother to a man who thought names are souvenirs. He buried that boy with ceremony enough to make the wind attend and sent a letter to Shanks with 3 names and 2 coordinates. Shanks sent a cutter and no comment. They both pretended they weren't allies because the world doesn't know what to do with contradictions except burn them or elect them. At Dressrosa, threads tangled, and everyone called it destiny until they cut themselves free. Shanks watched from a distance as children stopped being toys and soldiers learned how to apologize to themselves. He sent a slow clap in a memo to a woman named Tashigi, who was very busy cataloging swords that would never behave again. He approved Smoker's requisition for a boat that doesn't smell like failure. With a smiley face, he would deny in a court of law. And then the sea shifted the table again. A transponder snail woke Shanks at an hour that made honesty easier. The voice on the other end came wrapped in static and terror. A research station floating quietly between nothing and nothing had gone dark after a convoy of the new weapons had docked for maintenance. The station's last recorded words were not words. They were a sound like a child's drawing of a scream. Shanks dressed while the operator repeated the facts, and the cold in his hands took him straight back to a plaza under a scaffold. They made the run in hours that bent, engines complaining. The station loomed out of fog like a bruise the sky had grown. Its lights were wrong, either too bright or drunk. The docking clamps accepted them with the graciousness of a trap. Inside, the air had that hot metal tang of wires overworked and ethics underfunded. Cutaway, corridor lights strobing. Hina's iron 8 doors. Kobe's hand hovered over his hilt without moving, because sometimes the right grip is on your nerves. Bodies in lab coats lay where reluctant consciences drop when they meet a budget. The new weapons stood against the far wall in sleep that looked like prayer. One moved a finger. The thing in the center didn't belong to science or sanity. It was metal pretending to be flesh, and flesh pretending to be obedience, a hybrid of policy and nightmare labeled prototype, in neat stencils. Its eyes woke like shutters. It turned its head toward life. If Teach had been given tools and a grant, he would have built something with this laugh. Shanks stepped forward and realized what the elders had wanted him to do in the new world all along. Show the public that horror could be righteous if the uniform did it. "No cameras," he said, voice minimal. Hina's hand went through 2 lenses in as many seconds. The prototype leaned. It moved wrong, a clumsy grace that belonged to predators that had never had to learn stairs. It came at them fast, because speed is what you buy when you can't buy mercy. Shanks's blade met bone that wasn't. The sensation crawled up his arm and tried to make a home. He drove will into steel until steel remembered how to say no. Sparks wrote unreadable cursive in the air. The thing's counterpunch had weight, but no intent. It was a slap from a ledger. Hina's iron bit joints and bent them into better ideas. The prototype learned and ripped the iron like ribbon. Kobe slid under something that would have taken his head at a height he had only recently grown into, and came up with a slash that made its left eye reconsider loyalty. The lights flickered in applause and a warning. A klaxon started laughing. Overhead, heavy doors began to close with a bureaucrat's patient malice. Shanks calculated, hated the numbers, and made a choice that would tax him all year. He let the thing follow him away from the lab crew, trapped at the far end, and toward a cargo bay with blast windows and a long drop to a sea that didn't care. He heard Hina swearing poetry, heard Kobe redirecting men like chess, heard his ribs complain about the sprint. The prototype matched him, ragged and learning. It enjoyed this. They reached the bay. The storm outside slapped the glass. Shanks turned, put his back to the window, and pretended to run out of room. The prototype lunged with the glee of an algorithm finding a target. Shanks cut the supports on the blast window. Wind hit them like an accusation. Rain came sideways. He baited a step, another, and another, until its center of gravity forgot to ask its feet for permission. When it fell, it took a length of railing and a scream it had borrowed from men. It hit the sea, and the sea held it for exactly as long as it holds anything that doesn't belong. Shanks stood in the torn bay, coat slamming against his back, soaked, smiling like a man who hates that he's sweating. Kobe appeared at his side with a cut on his forehead that made him look younger and older. "You could have died," he said, which in Marine means thank you. "I keep telling you," Shanks said, eyes on the black water. "I'm heavier than I look." The report he filed read like dry history and wet courage. The line the fleet admiral circled in red was, "The prototype exhibited emergent targeting of non-combatants." The note scrawled in the margin in a hand that wrote like a punch read, "Prove it." Shanks sent back 3 names and 2 autopsies, and a photo of a child's ball melted into the decking. No further comments arrived. A budget meeting somewhere got louder. He started carrying the hat in his mind more often, and he hated that too. It made him sloppy in a way he couldn't see until a cut came late by a breath. He went to a yard at dawn and hit a post until his palms blistered, and then stopped when he realized he was punishing himself for doing the right thing again. And that road ends with either a statue or a criminal. He laughed into the wind at the stupidity of being human in a position designed to crush it out of you. Mihawk watched him once from a fence line and did not speak because every friendship needs a chapter without dialogue. At a small port called Renga, where the clouds like to sit low and eavesdrop, a boy drew an admiral with red hair on a chalkboard, and the teacher said not to, and the boy did anyway because he liked the way the chalk felt. At a brothel in the West Blue, an old woman said sailors no longer scared her because the one with the quiet eyes had come in once, said nothing, left too much money, and stopped a fight by standing in the doorway until the fighters felt silly. On a trawler in the South Blue, a captain yelled at a storm that listened because he had learned that sometimes the world yields to confidence if you carry it without greed. In Marineford, a noble asked whether the admiral had forgotten who he served. A masked agent said, "He remembers exactly. That's the problem," and got 3 budgets cut and 2 missions doubled for telling the truth out loud. Then the sea wrote a letter in waves instead of ink and signed it with a tooth. A report came from a fog belt where compasses misbehave. Blackbeard had assembled something like a fleet with something like a plan. He'd picked a string of islands, fat with timber and thin with navies, and offered them the same bargain he always does: cheeks or teeth. The Marines had three options: hit the head and lose the body, hit the body and feed the head, or defend the heart and let the limbs swing wild. Shanks argued for the third in a briefing room that smelled like coffee and fear. "He's not after flags," he said, tapping the map. "He's after leverage. If he owns supply, he rents morality." Akainu wanted the head. Kizaru wanted a nap. Aokiji wasn't in the room anymore. In the end, bureaucracy did its favorite trick and compromised in a way that made everyone equally angry: split the fleet. Shanks took the heart. He moved fast, putting ships where storms liked to corner merchants, placing men on docks where fear had already unpacked. It ended in a bay shaped like a mouth. Blackbeard arrived with enough confidence to float a city and enough guns to sink one. He put his flagship dead center and all but waved at the cameras. Shanks set his line along the inner curve and told his gunners not to play hero. Break masts, not men. The first volley ripped the air so hard the gulls forgot to get out of the way. Cannonballs hit water like punctuation. Shanks watched for the move Teach always makes, the feint that looks like a joke and whose punchline is murder. Here it came, a small, ugly boat slipping the line with a banner nobody recognized and a cargo nobody wanted to recognize. Women and children stacked behind barrels, so the shot that saved them would kill them. Shanks didn't swear. He didn't have that luxury left. He split his flagship's fire like a surgeon's hand and guided a chain shot into the boat's rudder with a correction that sang down the line. The boat slewed without capsizing. Marines and cutters moved like a cord, grabbing lines, blades coming out to cut ropes, not throats. Blackbeard watched this with amusement that curdled and called across the water in a voice the world had learned to hate. "You see, he always picks lives." Shanks answered in a voice that carried, even through smoke. "Yes." The rescuers made it back with bodies alive enough to be terrified. Teach launched the strike he'd wanted while every heart was turned sideways. Shanks caught the second wave with geometry and hurt, and the bay learned a new definition of balance. It was less a fight than a sentence, whose grammar refused to resolve. In the end, Blackbeard left with 2 masts, a new scar, and a roar of laughter he would one day fail to make. Shanks held the bay with 4 ships afloat and 57 men down, and a town still standing, but changed forever by the knowledge that it had been famous for a morning. He walked the pier when the smoke thinned and found a child clutching a splinter like it was a wand. He knelt, let his coat fall in the salt, and took the splinter. "Trade," he said, offering the child his badge for 1 second, then tapped the badge back to his own chest and left the splinter with its rightful wizard. He sent a letter to Fuchsia he would never know if anyone read. "Take care of your bars and your boats. The world is loud." He drank one night with Garp and didn't talk about grandsons. Garp ate crackers and looked at the sea like it owed him a rematch. "You could leave," he said. "Go be a legend in a different way." "I tried that," Shanks said softly. "The hat wouldn't let me." "Hats are bossy," Garp agreed, and they laughed like thieves on a roof. He dreamed of Marineford sometimes, but not the blood parts. He dreamed of the moment before the magma, the breath in the plaza, when his brain told him the calculus and his body told him the answer. And every time he woke, he felt both ruined and repaired. He thought of Ace on decks under different stars, of Luffy punching trees until they forgave him, of Blackbeard grinning at the edges of maps like a stain, and he tied his coat again in the morning because men had to see it and either hate it or trust it. Both reactions kept him honest. He trained Kobe to listen and not worship. He made Hina head of a unit that soldered seams between policy and mercy, so quietly the budget didn't notice. He checked on Smoker, who kept doing the right-wrong thing until his superiors gave up and called it initiative. He sent Mihawk a bottle with no note and got it back empty with a cut on the cork as acknowledgement. He attended meetings where the words acceptable losses, tried to wear a tie, and left every time with his jaw tight enough to chip. And out there, at the edge of a chart no one had finished, the Thousand Sunny climbed a slope of water like a joke the sea enjoyed and dove into a sky that didn't belong to anyone yet. And the boy with the hat looked at the horizon and grinned so hard the world tilted toward him, while a man in a white coat with a pirate smile set his blade on the map exactly where two storms would meet, and waited for the knock he'd known was coming, since a bar in a village smiled at a promise.